And welcome, Katrina. Thank you for joining us. Very kind of you. Katrina is here from the REF2028 team. We have various other teams, institutions represented here today from across the UK because, as expected, lots of interest in the most recent announcement after the conclusion of the FRAP consultation, giving us some initial indications of what is coming down the road to us for REF 2028. My interest, of course, is in impact, and that is the focus of today's session. I think, given my interest in impact culture, we can probably extend this to the big issues around research culture, which is kind of what's headlined the changes. And generally getting positive feedback from across the sector. But I think all of this positivity is very tentative, given the fact that we don't know a lot yet. And so I do suspect Katrina is going to be saying, not sure, don't know yet, we'll wait and see, to a lot of your questions. I can see Katrina nodding. But already I've managed to get some quite useful clarifications from Katrina and Stephen around some of the more ambiguous wording in the announcement. And so I'm going to share what I've learned so far and my take home from the announcement and a few of my own questions. And then we're going to hand over to you guys for you to ask your questions, whatever they are. So do get them coming in the chat already. And if you want my blog version of this, which I will be updating, based on what I learned today from all of you, this is what I am going to be
fast track impact the organization.
Yes, that is me, and I'm just going to put everyone back on mute again. Great, there we go. So here we are. I need to actually hit go on my slides. Let's try that again. So just, first of all, just introduce the workshop and the goal of today's workshop. We've just got an hour. So the first goal is to clarify what this new guidance actually means, as far as we can, of course, given that a lot of this is going to be decided by panels and others in the coming months. And in particular, this is around engagement and impact, but maybe a bit around research culture as well. I'd like not to get too into the thick of everything else, given that we've only got an hour, if that's okay. But secondly, I'd like to get an opportunity. I don't want this to just be a kind of a Q&A for Katrina. I'd like this to be very much a sharing of our perspectives, in particular, what we think this might mean for our institutions and what we can all learn from each other as we all busily interpret and prepare and think about this. That's the goal. So as you'll see from my blog, I think there are 4 key take-home messages in relation to impact that we can infer either directly or indirectly, mainly directly, from the guidance. The first is that there is now going to be a reduction in the minimum number of case studies needed to make a submission. So you'll only need 1 impact case study if you are a small group. I think for some institutions, that's going to be a bonus. There are some who decided not to submit on this basis. I do know of others who decided, you know what, we can cobble something together. And if you're not too worried about getting 1-star or unclassifiable and you really want to submit, then people were submitting anyway. But for some people, this is going to make a difference. We also have the reintroduction of this idea of an impact narrative that accompanies our impact case studies at the unit level. And I'm assuming that this is where the additional information about engagement is going to sit, but that's one of my questions for Katrina, if there is any clarity on that yet. And the assumption there is that this will be reporting not only on the engagement that we might have done to generate the impacts we're claiming in our case studies, but all of that other great engagement that we do, public engagement, schools engagement, other things that are having impacts, but maybe not the kind of impacts that we're going to headline as impact case studies, but that is important nonetheless, and not captured in KEF, and so kind of slipping between our fingers and kind of not being reported. And so clearly that is a good thing if we can capture some of that stuff. There is the removal of the 2-star threshold. This was recommended by Lord Stern after 2014, for some reason not adopted in 2021, adopted now. Very obviously, we do not need research to be internationally original and academically significant for it to have impact. It just needs to be rigorous. The definition of what makes research is the key thing here, and I'm expecting more guidance on this. If anyone is listening, the key thing, as far as I'm concerned, is that there is guidance around not only what is research, i.e. new knowledge, but what makes that rigorous research, because clearly we don't want impacts based on flaky evidence that end up going wrong. So it has to be based on research, presumably rigorous research, but that's all now. Having said that, we already only had to reach that 2-star as a body of work, and we could already submit quite a lot of stuff below that threshold last time round. I don't think it's really stopped any case studies going ahead, but it's nice to have that formalised. And finally, we've got this new criterion that has been introduced around rigour, and I've clarified, and it is clear this is about the rigour of engagement. Stephen was saying that Stephen Hill, who works with Katrina, was saying that this came from the consultation feedback from NCCPE, National Coordinating Centre on Public Engagement. Didn't quite get that acronym right, did I? And this was essentially around best practice engagement. So when you read the word rigour, I think we're reading best practice. And if you want a kind of a sense of what that might look like, you can have a look at NCCPE's guidance on best practice engagement. Of course, that's around public engagement, and there are many other forms of engagement online with other kinds of organisations, third sector policy, business engagement, for example. So we're going to have to probably generalise and extend that. And this, for me, leads to a number of questions. And I'll conclude with these and see if I want to see what other questions you've got, and we'll move to a Q&A session to start with before then meeting our second goal. So my first question would be around, what about impacts that don't actually require engagement? So there are plenty of examples of policy impacts, for example, where policy colleagues have gone and reviewed the evidence themselves, maybe even done some synthesis work, without the academics themselves having any direct engagement with them, and they've then put that into policy. Perhaps there was engagement with, say, Scottish government, but then English government decided that's a great idea, and it now starts spreading around the world based on people's policymakers' engagement with their other policy colleagues. Again, no direct engagement with the researchers themselves. And I think that the reason, which is a laudable reason, that we include this is that we want to make sure that we are changing the culture and practice around impact to increase its integrity. and best practice engagement is part of this, and there are a lot of very poor practices that we want to weed out and hopefully prevent happening. But there are many other drivers of what has been called grimpact, popularly, impact gone wrong, and many of the most publicised versions, so MMR vaccine, for example, the list goes on, is actually based on flawed research. Hence the need to think about what we mean by research, and I think there are many other causes of impacts that go wrong, not just flawed or badly done engagement. So a few questions still, and hopefully a bit more clarity in my attempt to summarise what I see as the key changes around impact. And I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over to you. So I'd like us to pose questions in the chat, please. That's where we're going to take the questions, and I'm going to let Katrina choose which of these questions she feels able to answer now. And then I will then facilitate discussion around that. So we will have some on-mic discussion and interplay as well, but we'll start on chat if that's okay. Just makes things a little bit more manageable. So Katrina, any initial reactions? I'll maybe put those questions from me in the chat for you, just to practice what I'm preaching. There we are. And we've got one from Saskia as well. How far is the accompanying impact narrative likely to be based on a questionnaire? Yeah, okay, great. And the questions coming in thick and fast now. So Katrina, not meaning to put you on the spot, but you have very kindly offered to be on the spot, so thank you. Over to you.
I'm very happy, and yeah, I think what I'm sort of initial reactions from this and a lot of other things on Facebook is just on Twitter largely is just how concisely people manage to sum up the the guidance that we've taken many pages to describe. But yeah, we could do with employing, I think, a few more people who can summarize it so well. I think I'll go through your questions first of all. I think might be the first one. I think the criterion of rigour, as you say, came largely from a suggestion from NCCPE, so is thinking particularly about engagement. It's of obvious relevance to the impact statement, where we'll be outlining further engagement beyond or impacts beyond the case studies, but also thinking about approaches more broadly to impact. I know in your blog you raised about the ethics of impact, taking ethical approaches, considering EDI within that, and those are things that I think we would consider to be elements of rigour. This is something that we're going to have to work with, particularly with the panels. Anything to do with criteria have to be agreed and discussed with the panels, and that's sort of when that will come in. I agree that there are obviously sort of very many types of substantial impact that happen serendipitously that don't require engagement. I would say that, yes, I think primarily it's of relevance to the impact narrative. However, if you are taking the scores, the criteria holistically, as we would have done in the past with reach and significance, then reach, significance and rigour, if you include that, but you simply say, well, actually, it was done as rigorously as they could because there was no engagement, I think that would be a fairly reasonable holistic judgment to reach, rather than saying you can't tell because there's none. Sorry, I'm now going around the other ones. Yes, Grimpact and flawed research. I mean, I think I would say is, given the MMR one and sort of how long it took for that to be exposed, 2-star research, sort of 2-star minimum was not a protection necessarily against that. And I think the reason behind removing the 2-star minimum, as you say, it was suggested by Lord Stern back after 2014, was really that we did hear quite a lot that it was stopping people putting in case studies that were based particularly on non-traditional outputs. So ironically, on the policy reports or the co-produced work that is so impactful, but actually people were nervous, particularly maybe in central research offices, to understand whether that was of high quality. We heard also from some institutions that they were using what we would think of as sort of not particularly helpful proxies for quality when they were determining the minimum. So using journal impact factors as a shorthand and saying, well, it's fine, it's in Nature, so it must be 2-star, so we can use a case study based on that. Those are principles we don't see as being compatible with the REF principles, and I think so. I think that's, but it's largely about opening it up and recognizing that impacts happen from a range of outputs that may not necessarily fit the very rigid 2-star criterion. You know, after all, 1-star research is still recognized by, is still rigorous within this. And so we wanted to open that up and not restrict institutions, particularly given the kinds of outputs or research that would have maybe not been seen as safely passing the 2-star thresholds. And then reporting on engagement will be in the impact statement that goes alongside it. Sort of, you can continue obviously to talk about engagement within the case study if that's what's the sort of pathway to impact and that's how it's formed, but the statement will allow for that wider discussion of all the good bits that don't make it into one case study. Perhaps it's those sort of almost the kind of failed case studies, but failed in a good way. The case studies where actually everything was done rigorously, there was a real attempt to engage with people, engaging whether that's public or policy or anything, but for some reason, change of government, change of prime minister, it can happen. It means that it didn't actually come to pass, that there's actually a space for that to be recognised.
Yeah, so
I'm aware I'm talking a lot.
If I can just come back on that point about the rigor of the research, and I wonder, is it feasible? Is it possible? Is it likely that there will be any kind of indication of rigor or any review of those outputs? Or given the fact that it was so hard to measure before, and we were using a whole lot of inappropriate proxies for your flawed, potentially Nature article, is this just something we're not going to evaluate now and take on good faith that this is rigorous?
I think there will still be, we've got to work this, as you say, this is one of the areas where I'm saying sort of, I don't know yet. There will still be a space to outline the underpinning research and outline how it meets the kind of the criteria that it is research. It's not based on teaching, for example, unless it's sort of, that's the very way. But yeah, that it's and we'll have to think about whether we ask institutions to outline in that section how they ensure that the research was rigorous. I don't think we'll be looking for sort of outputs as evidence there in that, but largely because we might be wanting to look at research that doesn't come in naturally sort of easy output form for that. Sort of one of the things our chair of the International Advisory Group is from New Zealand. He was talking a lot about transdisciplinary research, co-produced research, particularly with Aboriginal and Indigenous people, where the form of knowledge that's produced isn't ever a written output. And so actually, but it's a very valuable form and rigorous form of research. And so that's the kind of thing where you couldn't prove it. There's no DOI on that kind of research. So it's, yeah, those are extreme cases, but the ones that we want to make space for.
Yeah, and hopefully more common cases as we
hopefully, yeah.
A decolonizing agenda that says, yeah, should we only value things that you can put into the written word and publish formally? Absolutely, yeah.
Exactly, and it's similar with the contribution to knowledge and understanding element as well, as trying to find a way to capture those wider forms of research, the processes of research as well.
Okay, brilliant. So welcome those of you who are joining late, still people dribbling in. You can see a number of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to let you read. No silence is uncomfortable. You need time to read, so I'm going to stop talking, let you read, and then come back when you're ready, Katrina.
So there's two around about the impact narrative from Saskia. I think we are hoping, much like the rest of it, to make it more of a questionnaire format. We've had feedback on the overall those narrative elements that were the environment statement last time round, that actually they're very burdensome to complete at times because they're so free and open, and actually. It's about finding that sweet spot, about not being too constraining, so that it's not a one size fits all, but about asking targeted questions that help us to understand and help the panels to assess. So yes, I would say it's likely to be a questionnaire. The questions are TBC. Whether it's going to be integrated with the other aspects of the disciplinary level statements, that is our intention. So our intention is that it's not a whole series of separate statements that are submitted, that it is essentially what would have been the environment statement, but that the scores are made up, the section scoring goes into the more relevant sub-profile, quality sub-profile, is where sort of the contribution to knowledge and understanding will feed into that part of it. What we do want to think about, though, is making sure that the impact assessors are very heavily involved in looking at the impact narrative statements, which wasn't necessarily the case all the time. So making sure about that, so that there will be some kind of very practical operational side of things in the assessment process, making sure that the right people are looking at this. It's going to be similar for the people, culture and environment as well, that you're going to need different types of expertise for some of those elements as well. So it's going to be exciting for whoever is working out the panel logistics next time round to think about that there's in broadening this out and reshaping it, it's also making sure that we have the expertise brought in the right way at the right time.
Brilliant.
So the sliding, Simon's asking about the sliding scale on FTE for impact case studies. I think we had a long discussion about whether we wanted to reduce the minimum, and it was we decided that actually, if we're moving the narrative statements into that, it wouldn't be one case study counting for absolutely everything, placing a huge amount of pressure on, particularly on the individuals associated with that case study. We decided then, and I say we're still consulting on this, so very happy to have any different feedback on that. But the idea then about the sliding weighting for the statement is to always ensure that it's never worth more than one case study, or rather the other way around. So again, to avoid that disproportionate burden falling on that. So if you're only submitting one case study, it's 50%, and then it goes down with that. So again, sort of trying as far as possible to make sure that it's about the unit rather than small aspects of the units. But as I say, we go into these things with the best of intentions. I hope everyone does at least realize that. But yeah, we know that we can't necessarily understand what unintended consequences might come from that, and are very interested to hear if anyone does have any concerns around about that. Similarly, yeah, with the removing the or sort of moving to a minimum of one. The thinking was to reduce burden, particularly on small institutions. But yeah, we're very happy to hear if that's not actually going to be the case, and if we're going to do more damage. But it seems to be welcome, sort of from particularly from smaller institutions. I think it seems to be quite a welcome change.
Right.
Let's see.
Thank you, Katrina.
What else we got?
Tig has one about the word impact versus the language around engagement, and yeah, trying to keep some of that complexity interested. I'm not sure if I fully understood your question. I wonder, Tig, if you want to come in and explain that one a bit.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Mark. Sorry, it's probably a bit more abstract than some of the more specific questions. But I suppose I'm just reflecting on how engagement can mean lots of different things. And sometimes people can think about it as involvement of patients, engagement with community groups, as you mentioned before, Mark, engagement with policymakers. And I think that complexity is great. You know, it's a really useful thing about that word. But I suppose when we move into REF things, sometimes we narrow that down and we look for specific criteria that we can identify specific routes and articulations of engagement. So I guess it's kind of a long-winded way of asking if we can kind of keep that broadness of those definitions and therefore be a bit more permissive of different types of impact and a diversity of people and ideas, really.
Yeah, so much clearer. Yeah, thank you.
That's fully the intention. That's sort of the very clear intention behind this. I would say of the whole broadening, I think is probably the sort of diversifying is probably the kind of key word for most of our intentions across all of the changes. I would caution that quite often we go in with these notions and then things get whittled down and whittled down and whittled down because people want certainty. People want to know exactly what we mean by X, Y, and Z. And so my kind of plea back to the sector then is kind of, if you want broad criteria, don't keep asking for narrower and narrower definitions. It's tricky, but I understand it's such a high stakes game. Of course, people want to know that they're going to be hitting the right thing. I just think if we can keep it as broad as possible, I don't think that has a negative impact on robustness. I just think it creates that space to recognise and reward a far wider, more diverse range of things.
Completely agree. Thanks a lot.
Great. So Katrina, I'll just let you read through and choose which ones you think you can answer.
Yeah. Oh. So I'm seeing how will the HESA staff volume calculation compare the FTEs identified in REF2021, larger UOAs? So they will, so I think larger UOAs will also see a reduction in the required number of case studies. There's a reduction across the board with that. We talked long and hard, and we had a brilliant person on secondment from Durham University. I don't know if Karen McMillan's on this, but she did some great modelling about the impact of the different sliding scales on different types of institutions, different disciplines, and we felt this is the one that reduced burden most fairly across it, targeting it most at smaller institutions while still sort of spreading it around. I think, you know, that the average, we're planning to use an average FTE this time round rather than cut on a census date, and so that may change the way things look. We are only able to do that this time around for 2 years, just because of the way sort of timings with HESA, but it is our intention to do it the next time round. And part of that is to stop that kind of drop off or the kind of perverse incentives around about the census date that we saw in sort of hiring practices. But again, it is one of the areas that we're asking about. We haven't really asked about it in relation to impact case studies, but interested if there are any sort of implications of that for impact.
Can I just clarify then, you were saying that there's a reduction in the number of case studies that is going to be required the next time around across the board, but where that is going to be of particular relevance is both for smaller and larger submissions. So it's at the kind of the two ends of the spectrum. They will have a lower burden on them. Is that correct?
I think more towards the smaller end. I'm looking at Simon actually, because he's almost certainly done the modelling around about that, and sort of where the benefits are most likely to be felt. It was really interesting. We were thinking about kind of splitting, sort of creating the different bands and looking at the kind of different sizes, and we realised that if we sort of went for the under 20 FTE, was around about sort of 40% of REF submissions, that actually sort of what we were in the past saying was the smallest sort of submission range was actually making up a large chunk of everything overall, which is why we decided then to kind of break down the bottom into under 10 and then 10 to 20. So I have to admit I don't have the modelling up or sort of firmly imprinted in my brain, but yeah, this, as far as I remember, was the sort of model that we felt was fairest across the board. So yeah, I think that's where at least we thought. No.
Did you want me to chip in, Mark?
Oh yeah, go on, sorry.
Yeah. I've been unmuted, which is probably dangerous. Yes, so definitely from my point of view, the one impact case study for this small submissions is a huge advantage for them. And we've had the discussion in the chat about, well, if they're 9.5 or 10, then they still probably have to develop 2, but hopefully they'll know about a year in advance what their FTE is going to be. And so that shouldn't be too much of a problem. For the mid-sized ones, sort of 20 to 50 FTE, then it's broadly the same as it was before. I guess with the reduction in outputs, then an impact case study is worth relatively more than an output, relatively more per output than last time. As you've unmuted me, I'm going to ask the horrible question for Katrina, and she can, of course, decide not to take this one, which is when you get to the really big submissions above the sort of 110, 150, and we're down to 1 case study per 50. If you imagine a really large submission, which there were some, about 350 or so on, then surely they gain a huge advantage because they only need half as many impact case studies per member of staff than a submission of about 100 FTE. And I know that's what it was last time. And I did ask him a number of times, but I didn't get an answer, which I agreed with, but it may be just because I don't understand.
I mean, I think part of it was, yeah, and again, we're interested in kind of hearing the views here. Part of this came from the panels and their sense that actually it was, in a sense, not quite a waste of their time, sounds very, but they sort of said that they were getting no no more information than was useful by the time sort of they were reading a certain number. They weren't kind of noticing, you know, a massive drop off in sort of in quality after sort of a certain time. They felt that they had enough, and in terms of their time and the time of those departments spent producing them, then that was that it was felt to be sort of essentially not the best use of a panel's time to look at those. I would agree that yes, sort of that there are going to be kind of that was the way we decided or tried to address that this time round, is by looking at the bottom rather than by looking at the top, thinking about the overall costs of the exercise, particularly thinking about it. I think it's quite often not thought about so much at the kind of panel level. I think we think about a lot about the costs, either direct costs REF or costs to institutions, but actually the burden on the panels, and so, I mean, you know this firsthand from having seen it, that the amount of work and the very tight time frame that they're working to, I think it was generally felt, and a lot of those are in main panel A, and main panel A's opinion was that it wasn't helpful to have a massive number. Is it fair? I don't know. I think that's a good question. I think what we have done is tried to make it as fair as possible, and taking into account that. But you are always going to have economies of scale. I think that's always going to be an issue, because even if you did massively increase the number for those large ones, the chances are that they would still have the support mechanisms in place to help them to write those additional ones. So yeah, I think it's still a slightly fudged answer, but I think we'd say we try to address that potential inequity at the bottom end rather than the top end.
Yeah, so I think still in summary, 20 to 50 FTE, pretty much the same amount of case studies as 2021, above 50, a bit less, depending on how big you are, and below 20, a lot less. Is that, yeah, a good summary? Good. So we're over halfway in our time, and there's still lots of questions. The sense I have is that this is adding lots of value. These are great questions, so I'd like to continue if that's okay, Katrina.
Yeah, that's why you never, if you're from Research England, you can never come to one of these things and lurk in the background. It's pretty much impossible. So, but do sort of, yeah, if people are getting bored of my voice, then I'm very happy to stop. I'm just sort of trying to, I'm not very good at the reading and discussing, I have to say.
Oh, that's fine. So take your time, read, and we will wait patiently.
I'm just going to go with sort of various ones. I think the sort of easy one, do we expect the sources to corroborate impact to be defined similarly to REF2029? I think so. I don't see any compelling reason to change that. I think we're, in terms of, you might sort of laugh at this given that there have been some quite radical changes, but we are where we can keep things the same. We're trying to, and I think that'd be one of the areas that that I wouldn't see a great advantage to changing anything. I think it would cause more confusion. And we do know that letters of testimony were helpful, and were in some cases the only appropriate and effective source for corroboration. So yeah, I would, and I know that a lot of the panels value them as well. So I would say, yeah, I can't see that being chucked out or changed. God, we've answered that, I think, a little bit. Right. Oh, a quite good question around about metrics for people and culture, and sort of feeding into this stated intention to rely on metrics for people and culture section, and whether it's going to turn into a box ticking exercise. I don't think we're looking, well, I'm going to say we're certainly not looking to turn it into a box ticking exercise. It's not a multiple choice questionnaire. I think what we are looking to do is see if we can find for people in culture some more robust indicators that are outcomes focused, rather than one of the kind of criticisms of the previous environment statements is that they're quite focused on sort of policies and sort of strategies, but with very little accountability for their outcomes. And what we want to do is try and identify those kinds of outcomes and the information we require on that. We won't be having any uncontextualized data. It goes against the DORA principles and many other responsible research assessment ones, is that we would expect any indicators that we use to be contextualized and explained in the context. What we will have to look at, and we're doing, I think, you know, a sort of really big piece, about to commission a really big piece of work to look at those indicators for the people, culture and environment section. And that we'll have to think about sort of those. And one of the things we'll have to think about is whether we are having a standard set of indicators required across the board, or whether it remains a kind of basket of indicators. And there's so many factors we're going to have to take into account when thinking about that. One of the major ones obviously is robustness, but also the burden. We want to make sure that where possible we're reusing data that are being collected elsewhere for other purposes. Also just thinking, and this is going to be sort of for someone else a bit further down the line to think about, but thinking about systems interoperability, that if they're being collected elsewhere, that we're actually gathering them either directly or sort of in the same format, that you're not having to sort of submit something in a different format for REF, where you're submitting it to HESA in a different way, or for example. So that's going to be one of the big pieces of work to think about. So yes, we want to include more indicators that are more sort of hard evidence, as it were, to back up the outcomes of the sort of claims being made in the environment sections, but they won't be just a set of numbers.
Yeah, great. So good to hear there's some chunky research being commissioned on that, because that is going to be tricky. Yes, yeah, we're just drafting the commission for that at the moment. So the thorny question of interdisciplinary research. We have been thinking about that a lot throughout this, particularly our international advisory group. Have 2 or 3 of the members were very, very sort of keen supporters and experts in inter and transdisciplinary research. We discussed, for example, whether we should assess things at main panel level rather than at unit of assessment level, and move to that level, whether we should create an interdisciplinary panel, which I know was discussed before REF 2029. The sense was that wouldn't help, because, you know, sort of just because you're an expert in interdisciplinarity within your disciplinary area, you always, interdisciplinary researchers have some kind of disciplinary home, and are not simply experts in interdisciplinarity. So I think we kind of got rid of that idea pretty early on. I think there are a number of measures that will make it easier. I think actually the removing the minimum 2-star requirement for the impact case study, a lot of the interdisciplinary outputs are exactly those that are non-traditional forms of outputs. They tend to be less traditional, or they tend to also, we know this, be in journals with lower impact factors, which, as we know, has absolutely nothing to do with quality. But when they were taking those, when they're being used by institutions as proxies for quality, can mean that they are disadvantaged nonetheless. We're hoping also that creating the space and contribution to knowledge and understanding will open up again that space to talk about wider work that you do with the discipline and other disciplines, rather than focusing again solely on outputs. We will be, I'm not sure whether this thing, we'll be getting rid of the interdisciplinary flag. I think everyone's going to be delighted to hear that. I think everyone agreed that didn't work particularly well. But we do still want to have in place measures to support the assessment of interdisciplinary outputs. There were a number of recommendations from interdisciplinary advisory panel from last time round. And I think what we're wanting to do is not radically change those,
but integrate the interdisciplinary advisory panel more into the assessment process through the network of the interdisciplinary advisors, and kind of make sure that they are very much embedded. So it's yeah, it should be. That's still, again, one of these details that has to be worked out. I think we got there a little bit late with interdisciplinary structures last time round. I think there's a strong sense in the panels that actually it wasn't, interdisciplinary research wasn't disadvantaged, but I think it was a slightly painful process to kind of get that. I think there was a lack of clarity early on what the interdisciplinary advisors on the panels were there to do, and so I think a bit of clarity earlier on around about that.
Great. So I can just see 3 more questions relevant to impact, if I can navigate us to them. So a couple of quite quick, easy ones, hopefully. Donna asking if section 3 references to the research in an impact case study is likely to remain the same, or if it's going to change, and probably linked to that section and question. Leslie's one, contextual data for grants, will that be required again? Do you know?
So that is getting into a sort of a next level of detail at the moment. So I can only sort of say what I would imagine, and I'm sort of coming out with the disclaimer that I'm not going to be the REF2029 director. I'm sort of going back into my normal role in Research England once that person has started. So I'm making sort of promises on someone else's behalf with at the moment. But the intention, yeah, I think is that there would still be a section where you're outlining the research. I don't think you will need the references to research. I think will be there for context rather than the judgment for the 2-star quality. What was the other bit of the question? I've now forgotten.
Yeah, contextual data for grants, but
yeah, I mean, that is, my colleagues in the research councils, I think, would absolutely throttle me if I said we were going to get rid of it. I think one of the things, again, we are keen is that any sort of information gathered via REF is useful. We know that this information is incredibly useful for not just the research councils, for other funders as well, in terms of assessing their impact. It means there's actually quite a big cost reduction for the sector than if they were actually trying to go through and find out their impacts in a different way. But again, we're sort of happy to hear. I think what we will be abandoning, and again, I can't sort of promise this, is the guidance that we had on sort of standardizing the kind of indicators, the standard format. I think because we sort of made the compromise that we realized we couldn't mandate people to use a pound sign or GBP to do it in a standard way. And so despite asking people, some people took it very seriously and spent a lot of time, and we're very grateful to them. But because not everybody did, it ended up as kind of not particularly helpful. We're just in the middle of sort of finishing the impact case study analysis. The RAN team have been working very, very carefully on that. And I think we've come out with the same finding as last time, that there wasn't enough standardization across some figures used in the case studies to actually allow meaningful analysis. So I think that was one of those things that was well intentioned. Had we in some way actually mandated the use of standardized formats, it may have had the intended effect. But yeah, and I think it's one of the things to kind of warn future REF teams about, is sort of, if you're going to have something that's a requirement, make it a requirement. And I have heard pleas from probably everyone in this room to get rid of the word indicative from anywhere in the REF guidance, and I will pass that on to the REF 2028 team when they start. I think we in the panels think we're being helpful with this and creating flexibility, but it's constantly trying to find that sweet spot.
Great. So just one more question from Jed, and then I'll hand over to Simon, and we'll kind of move into just, exchanging other views, perspectives. I'm not expecting you to be able to answer this. The same thought has actually occurred to me. Is there a potentially overlap with KEF now that we're including engagement? Do you think there's going to be any consequences for that? I mean, that's well beyond your remit, but it's an interesting question.
It is, and it's something we have been kind of discussing, and it's one of the complicated things when talking about the KEF is that it's England. It doesn't, you know, sort of there are institutions beyond England who choose to participate, but it's sort of run by Research England, and so not everything is covered in the KEF, even if it were complete overlap. So that wouldn't count for all institutions. I think there may be areas where there are sort of similarities at the moment. It wouldn't be in any way kind of double dipping in terms of funding. And so I think that but they serve two different purposes, the KEF and the REF. And so I think if there's information that crosses over, they are being used in very different ways and for very different purposes. So I think there could potentially be overlapping content, and I think there's a lot to learn from our colleagues who run the KEF as well when we're thinking about indicators. But yeah, I think particularly around about public engagement, I think that there's perhaps a closer link with research coming through. That the REF is slightly more suited to non-metricized forms of evidence.
Yeah, good answer. Thank you. So Simon, over to you.
Yeah, it's really just to push you on that sort of use of the the pound sign and the dollars and all of that, because there was discussion about actually having actual metadata rather than just a word template. And given the value, the potential value of the case studies to UK PLC, particularly for us as a sector trying to get money from the Treasury, I mean, why not enforce it? And dare I even just say, yes, submit your case study with or without. If it doesn't have the appropriate metadata in, you'll lose half a grade point. Everyone will do it then. It will give us all a little bit of extra pain, but you know what? We will do it and it won't be a problem, and we'll just get so much more from the exercise. Everyone else is going to kill me now, but that's fine.
I was going to say, if we suggest that, then Simon, I'll put your name next to it.
yeah, please do. I'll never work again. It's fine.
But I mean, it is one of these questions that, yes, sort of it comes into wider discussions that we have constantly around about REF, and we talk a lot about the making sure that the cost and sort of administrative effort of REF is proportionate, and proportionate is also a very subjective term, and there are those things that would definitely increase burden for those completing a REF impact case study. But would it be outweighed by the benefit, as you say, to the sector as a whole to have that? And it's very difficult to make that call. And it may be when we're trying to find ways of keeping the burden to a minimum, that's exactly the kind of thing that is an easy thing for us to say we're not going to do. But it'd be interesting to hear from different parts of the sector whether they find that would be useful. And always always very difficult as well to get a sense of how much burden that would add, and I suspect it would be different across different institutions and depending on their systems, and depending on the obviously across disciplines as well.
Yeah, great.
So it's interesting, but I'm not sure I want to be the one to go out there and suggest it.
You have a willing emissary by the looks of things.
Yeah, go for it.
Great. So we've got 10 minutes left, and we've got people in REF teams from professional services. We've got academics on the call. We've got consultants who are supporting people to do their REF submissions. How are you preparing? What are you already changing and starting to think about based on what we already know? Maybe some brand new ideas based on what you've just heard now in terms of what you're going to go away and do after today. It'd be great to get some of your perspectives and hear from you what you think this means at an institutional level or for your practice. So great. Thank you, Jed, for kicking us off. Anyone else, you can add into the chat or raise a hand and we'll come to you. So Jed saying at Leeds, we ran impact awards with our criteria that tried to focus on process, so akin to the Rigour criterion and not the outcomes, i.e. impact. The reviewer said it was difficult to focus on the Rigour when they saw the shiny outcomes. Ooh. And I think one of the things that seems to answer this, at least what I've heard from Katrina so far, is that there's going to be a kind of a separation between them. So we're going to be talking about engagement in the narrative, and we'll be talking about that across the board, not just in relation to the impact case studies. So it's maybe not going to be so much of a problem, but yeah, I can totally imagine how that just totally biases things. I don't know if Katrina or anyone else has any perspectives on that.
Yeah, the interesting thing at Leeds is, you know, everything was in one narrative, so that's why it was hard to kind of do that separation. So it's useful to know that they kind of are being looked at almost separately, but in the round. You know, it'd be interesting to kind of know how they'll operationalize that holistic analysis of now 3 variables rather than 2.
Yeah, I can totally see how that would happen if it were integrated into the impact case study. You've got an incredible 4-star impact case study. You're going to look at the engagement in a positive light because it clearly worked, even if it was a little bit shaky. Yeah, and vice versa. If the outcome wasn't quite so good, maybe that's why it was the engagement, and we start looking in and now criticizing the engagement as well. Yeah, so a good call, I think, is what we're kind of saying in terms of keeping that separate. Good. Anyone else want to add in reflections, thoughts? What are you doing to prepare? What would constitute shaky engagement? So I'll give you an example. In fact, I was engaged as a member of my local community by an initiative. I need to not say too much here. So a big shiny new initiative comes into our local community, and we're going to engage with the community. So we all got invited to the headquarters to find out about their exciting vision. And the way in which it was framed started off by offending multiple members of the community. And then after this shiny new vision, everyone was asked to do a round robin, and these people, it was just right, you're next. What do you think? And everyone was like, yeah, it's nice. And multiple people just crumbled under the pressure. It was humiliating, embarrassing. And of course, nobody was actually going to say what they really thought. And the end of it, great. So clearly, you love our vision, and we're going to do this, and we've got the support of the community. And of course, the entire community went out and was like, "Who are these guys? This is a complete nightmare." And no, we're not going to cooperate with them or do anything they want. And yeah, so. If you look at Cook and Katharu's Tyranny of Participation from 2000, I think is a really nice indictment of all of the incredible things that are done in the name of engagement, in the name of participation, that are actually just ways of using communities to rubber stamp and legitimize things that people are doing. So yeah, there's an example.
Mark,
James,
just interestingly on that example,
yeah,
you know, if that was in REF, how would that data emerge in REF? I mean, the people coming to you and doing the shaky pointing at you probably wouldn't report that. You know, it's kind of there's an immediate bias in the actual evaluation itself, isn't there?
So I published a paper back in 2016 where we looked at engagement, and we asked the organisers, so how did that go? And we got one answer. We then went to the people they engaged and asked them, so how did that go from your perspective? And we got another answer, unsurprisingly. And our answer was a combination of the two. And of course, the conveners weren't being entirely misleading, but that was a perspective. But you're right, if this organization was a research organization, they were saying, we engaged, these are all the incredible people, and we got a cross-section of the entire community, they all came, everyone spoke, everyone said something positive, they love what we're doing, but actually it was totally dysfunctional and meaningless. James.
Sorry, it's okay. It was kind of the same thing as Jed. I'm just wondering, you know, these people will present what they did. How will anybody know that it was shaky because they won't present it as shaky? What will be the requirement to mitigate potential shakiness? Question for Katrina going ahead, I guess.
Really does make you think, doesn't it? I mean, if Katrina and her team or the panels have to work out how do you judge what is good practice and prevent just kind of a whitewash on this, it's a bit of a nightmare.
I think the kind of thing that we'd be thinking about is because obviously is thinking about how rigorous evaluation is built into engagement as well. So if there were evidence of rather than having to require sort of that for every single bit of engagement, if in your statement you outline how your staff are well trained in evaluating their engagement rigorously, how they are well trained in engaging ethically, understanding imbalances and power structures, then I think then you have the structure. We will never be able to get at every single thing, even sort of in the current one. It's very difficult to drill down into every single detail of every single engagement event. But I think what you can do is look at the unit as a whole and the rigor of their approach to engagement and impact, which would include good understanding of the ethics, a good understanding of how to evaluate effectively. So that would be so at a slightly higher level beyond the actual sort of level of the individual engagement. Yeah. But yeah, I saw someone saying about corroborating sources for Rigour, which did sort of make me think it's a very interesting one. As I say, there is a lot for the panels to hammer out. Luckily, we have quite a lot of sort of expertise also gathered here as well that I think will be able to contribute to helping understand that, while making sure it's robust, but also not then massively onerous that they're getting corroborating sources for absolutely everything. It's tricky, and that's where I think sort of it's easier to find evidence of sort of good, strong supporting structures that it is necessarily to look at it on an individual event basis or engagement basis.
So we're going to conclude at this point, but if you were looking for something to go and prepare, go away and make some strong supporting structures for your engagement. There's something we can all do. So it has been great. Thank you, especially Katrina. It's been really valuable. Thank you, everyone, for your fascinating discussion and questions. I'm going to post this onto YouTube. I'll embed it in a revised version of my blog, and I will send that around to you as soon as I've managed to get that done. It's been a pleasure. Do feel free to hang around if you want some informal chat. Otherwise, I'm going to close this and say thank you, everyone.